Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling one of the most important and influential works in political philosophy.
It's a big one.
It is. We're talking about On Liberty by John Stuart Mill.
Published all the way back in 1859.
That's right, 1859. And yet it still feels so relevant today, like we're still grappling with the same questions about individual freedom and the limits of societal control.
It's really incredible how much this book has shaped modern liberal thought. I mean, it's not just an academic text. It's a work that speaks to some of the most fundamental questions we face as individuals living in a society.
So who is John Stuart Mill? I mean, obviously he was a philosopher, but was he just some stuffy academic sitting in an ivory tower?
Far from it. Mill was this fascinating figure, a child prodigy who was basically raised to be an intellectual powerhouse by his father, James Mill, who was a close friend of Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders of utilitarianism.
Utilitarianism, for those who need a quick refresher, being the idea that the best actions are the ones that maximize happiness or well-being for the greatest number of people.
Exactly. And John Stuart Mill was initially a big proponent of utilitarianism, but he kind of went beyond that. He developed his own unique brand of liberalism that emphasized individual rights and the importance of personal autonomy.
Right. And we'll definitely delve into that more. But before we get too deep into the philosophy, I think it's worth noting that Mill's personal life was pretty unconventional, especially for his time.
Oh, absolutely. His relationship with Harriet Taylor, who was married to someone else when they met, caused quite a scandal in Victorian society.
It's really interesting to think about how that relationship might have influenced his views on individual liberty, particularly when it comes to women's rights.
That's a great point. It definitely challenges the image of Mill as this purely rational, detached thinker. He was deeply passionate about individual freedom, and his personal experiences clearly shaped his philosophical views.
So let's get into the book itself. What's the core argument of On Liberty?
At the heart of the book is this idea called the harm principle. Mill argues that the only legitimate reason for society to restrict individual liberty is to prevent harm to others.
Okay, so I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anyone else.
That's the basic idea, but it's not quite that simple. Mill draws a distinction between actions that directly affect others and those that primarily affect oneself. He's saying that society has a legitimate interest in preventing harm to others, but shouldn't interfere with actions that only affect the individual, even if those actions seem unwise or unconventional.
So, like, if I want to stay up all night reading philosophy, even if it makes me grumpy and unproductive the next day, that's my business.
Exactly. Society can try to persuade me that getting enough sleep is a good idea, but it can't force me to do it. As long as my sleep deprivation isn't harming anyone else, it's within my sphere of personal liberty.
That makes sense. But where do we draw the line? I mean, some actions might seem purely personal, but could have indirect consequences for others.
That's where things get a bit tricky. Mill acknowledges that there will always be gray areas and difficult cases. But he argues that we should err on the side of freedom, that the burden of proof should always be on those who want to restrict individual liberty.
So the assumption is that people should be free unless there's a very strong reason to restrict their freedom.
Exactly. Mill was deeply suspicious of paternalistic laws that try to protect people from themselves. He believed that adults are generally capable of making their own decisions, even if those decisions are risky or unconventional.
I can see how that could be controversial, especially in today's world, where we're so focused on safety and risk aversion.
It definitely goes against the grain in many ways. But Mill's argument is that protecting people from all potential harm would ultimately stifle individual growth and creativity. He believed that people need to be free to make mistakes and to learn from their own experiences.
So it's not just about individual rights, it's also about allowing for personal growth and development.
Right. Mill saw liberty as essential for both individual flourishing and societal progress. He believed that a society that values freedom is more likely to be dynamic, innovative, and intellectually vibrant.
To really drive home this point about the importance of liberty, Mill uses some pretty compelling historical examples, like the persecution of Socrates.
It's a classic case of a society silencing a dissenting voice, even though, ironically, Socrates was ultimately proven right in many of his criticisms.
And then there's the example of Jesus, who was also seen as a threat to the established order.
Exactly. Mill uses these examples to illustrate how stifling dissent can hinder progress and limit our understanding of the world. He believed that even seemingly false or dangerous opinions can have value because they force us to examine our own beliefs and to defend them rationally.
That's interesting because it suggests that Mill wasn't just advocating for tolerance, but for a genuine embrace of diverse perspectives, even those that might make us uncomfortable.
Absolutely. He saw this constant clash of ideas, even uncomfortable ones, as essential for intellectual growth and societal progress. He believed that without this ongoing challenge, our understanding of truth stagnates, and we risk becoming intellectually lazy and complacent.
But what about harmful ideas? Ideas that might incite violence or hatred? Surely there are limits to free speech, right?
That's a question we'll definitely explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
It's a big one. And it's one that's more relevant than ever in today's world with the rise of social media and the spread of misinformation.
It's a real challenge to find that balance between protecting freedom of expression and guarding against harm, especially in the digital age. But I think Mill's ideas can provide a valuable framework for navigating these complex issues.
So to recap, Mill's harm principle states that the only legitimate reason to restrict individual liberty is to prevent harm to others. And he believes that a society that values freedom is more likely to be dynamic, innovative, and intellectually vibrant.
So we're back talking about On Liberty. We ended last time on the question of harmful ideas and how those fit into Mill's concept of free speech.
Right, because he's all about this free marketplace of ideas, even uncomfortable ones.
He is, and it's important to remember the historical context here. Like, Mill is writing in Victorian England, a time when censorship was pretty commonplace.
So for him to come out so strongly in favor of free speech was pretty radical.
Oh, absolutely. He was pushing boundaries. And he believed that even ideas that might seem dangerous or offensive have a role to play in a healthy society.
How so?
Well, he argues that by allowing these ideas to be expressed and debated openly, we can better understand them, expose their flaws, and ultimately strengthen our own arguments.
So it's not about suppressing bad ideas, but about confronting them head on.
Right. Mill believed that trying to silence these ideas would actually make them more powerful, more alluring, especially to those who might already be susceptible to them.
Like forbidding something often makes it more tempting.
Exactly. He thought that by bringing these ideas out into the open, we could demystify them, subject them to rational scrutiny, and let people see them for what they really are.
That makes sense, but doesn't it also risk giving a platform to harmful ideas, allowing them to spread and potentially influence more people?
It's a valid concern, and Mill doesn't dismiss it lightly. He acknowledges that there are limits to free speech, particularly when it comes to speech that directly incites violence or harm.
So like yelling fire in a crowded theater.
That's the classic example. But even in less extreme cases, Mill argues that we need to consider the context, the intent of the speaker, and the potential consequences of their words.
It's not just about what's being said, but how it's being said, where it's being said, and why it's being said.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that the burden of proof should always be on those who want to restrict speech to demonstrate that there's a clear and present danger of harm.
So it's a high bar to clear.
It is. Mill was deeply skeptical of censorship. He believed that it's often used to silence dissenting voices and protect the status quo rather than to genuinely prevent harm.
Okay, I'm starting to get a better sense of Mill's approach to free speech. But I'm curious, what about Mill's personal life? We mentioned his unconventional relationship with Harriet Taylor earlier. How did that shape his thinking?
It's a fascinating aspect of his life and one that definitely influenced his views on individual liberty, especially when it comes to women's rights.
You know, for his time, their relationship was pretty scandalous.
Oh, definitely raised eyebrows in Victorian England.
I mean, they met when she was married to someone else, and their relationship, although mainly intellectual and emotional at first, was quite controversial.
It was. They couldn't really be open about their feelings for each other for many years because of social conventions.
And yet, they maintained this close relationship for over 20 years.
It was a deep intellectual partnership, and Mill often credited Harriet with helping him develop some of his most important ideas.
I've read that they even co-authored a book together, The Subjection of Women.
They did. It's a powerful critique of the patriarchal structures of their time, arguing for women to have the same rights and opportunities as men.
Which was a pretty radical idea back then.
Extremely radical. It challenged the prevailing view that women were somehow intellectually and emotionally inferior to men.
And this was a theme that Mill returned to in his other writings as well, right? This idea that social norms and expectations can often be arbitrary and oppressive, especially for women.
Absolutely. You can see how his personal experiences with Harriet might have shaped his thinking on this. He witnessed firsthand how societal pressures could limit individual freedom, particularly for women who are often denied basic rights and opportunities.
It's interesting to think about how their relationship might have influenced his broader ideas about individual liberty and the need to challenge restrictive social norms.
For sure. And it reminds us that Mill wasn't just some detached philosopher theorizing about abstract concepts. He was a real person with real passions and experiences that informed his thinking.
Right? He was living his philosophy, pushing boundaries, not just in his writing, but in his own life.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes his work so compelling. It's not just intellectual theorizing, it's a deeply personal exploration of what it means to be free.
Well, that brings us to another key aspect of On Liberty, his ideas about the role of government.
Right, because if individual liberty is so important, what role does government play? Does it just get out of the way?
Yeah, is it a completely hands-off approach?
Not quite. Mill believed that government has a role to play, but it should be a limited one, focused on protecting individual rights and ensuring that people are free to pursue their own goals without harming others.
So it's not about anarchy. It's about finding the right balance between individual liberty and the legitimate functions of government.
Exactly. He saw government as a necessary safeguard, not a hindrance to freedom. But he was also wary of government overreach, of what he called paternalistic laws that try to protect people from themselves.
Like laws against drug use or gambling.
Exactly. Mill argued that adults should be free to make their own choices, even if those choices seem risky or unwise to others.
As long as they're not harming anyone else.
Right. He believed that individuals are ultimately the best judges of their own interests, and that trying to shield people from all potential harm would stifle individual growth and lead to a stagnant society.
So it's about trusting individuals to make their own decisions, even if they make mistakes along the way.
Exactly. Mill saw mistakes as part of the learning process, as opportunities for growth and self-discovery.
It's interesting because this idea of individual responsibility is often seen as being in tension with the idea of social justice.
Right, because some might argue that if you emphasize individual responsibility too much, you neglect the role of systemic factors that can create inequality and limit opportunities for certain groups.
Like poverty or discrimination.
Exactly. And it's true that Mill doesn't fully address these issues in On Liberty. He focuses primarily on the relationship between the individual and the state, not on the broader social and economic structures that can shape individual choices.
So it's not a perfect framework.
No, it's not. But it's still a valuable starting point for thinking about the balance between individual freedom and the role of government. Welcome back to our deep dive into On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. We've been exploring Mill's ideas about freedom, the limits of societal control, and how those ideas play out in the real world. We've covered a lot of ground, but of course, no philosophical work is without its criticisms, right?
Exactly. And Mill's ideas, as radical as they were for his time, have definitely sparked debate and generated some pretty valid criticisms over the years.
They have, and I think it's important to address some of those criticisms head on to really grapple with the complexities of applying Mill's principles in a world that's constantly changing.
So where do we start? What are some of the main criticisms that have been leveled at Mill's work?
Well, one of the most common critiques centers on his harm principle. It sounds great on paper, right? The idea that we should only restrict individual liberty to prevent harm to others. But critics argue that in practice, it's not always so simple.
Because harm can be a pretty subjective concept, right? What one person considers harmful, another might see as perfectly acceptable.
Exactly. Take offensive speech, for example. Some people argue that certain types of speech, even if they don't directly incite violence, can be deeply harmful, especially to marginalized groups, creating a climate of intolerance and discrimination.
But then others would say that any attempt to restrict speech based on its potential to offend opens the door to censorship and the suppression of dissenting views.
Exactly. It's a slippery slope argument. And Mill himself acknowledged that there will always be gray areas when it comes to applying the harm principle. He argued that we should err on the side of allowing free expression, but he also recognized that there are limits.
It seems like finding that balance between protecting free speech and preventing harm is a constant challenge, especially in today's world with the rise of social media and online platforms where it's so easy for harmful ideas to spread rapidly.
It is, and Bill was writing long before the internet, so it's interesting to think about how his ideas might apply in the digital age.
He probably couldn't have even imagined the challenges we face today with things like hate speech and misinformation spreading online.
It's a whole new frontier. But I think Mill's emphasis on open dialogue, on confronting harmful ideas with reason and evidence rather than trying to suppress them, is more relevant than ever.
That makes sense. So the harm principle is one area where Mill has been criticized. What are some other critiques of his work?
Well, another common criticism is that Mill puts too much emphasis on individual liberty and doesn't give enough consideration to the needs of the community or the common good.
Like the idea that individual rights should sometimes be limited for the sake of the greater good.
Right. Think about public health measures during a pandemic, for example, where it might be necessary to restrict individual freedoms like travel or assembly to protect the population as a whole.
Or environmental regulations, which might limit certain industries or activities to protect the environment for everyone.
Exactly. These are situations where individual liberty might need to be balanced against the collective well-being of society.
And how did Mill address this tension between individual rights and the common good?
Well, he acknowledged that individual freedom cannot be absolute, and that there are times when it's necessary to restrict liberty for the sake of the greater good. But he argued that such restrictions should be carefully considered, justified by a clear and present danger, and applied in the least restrictive way possible.
So it's not that he was against any limits on individual freedom, it's that he set a very high bar for when those limits are justified.
Exactly. He believed that the burden of proof should always be on those who want to restrict liberty, to demonstrate that there's a compelling reason to do so and that the benefits outweigh the costs.
It sounds like Mill was very cautious about giving too much power to the government or to the majority to restrict individual freedom.
He was, and that's another area where he's been criticized for not fully addressing the issue of power imbalances in society.
You mean how social structures and inequalities can limit the freedom of certain groups, even in the absence of explicit legal restrictions?
Exactly. Like someone living in poverty might technically have the same legal rights as someone who is wealthy, but their ability to exercise those rights and live a truly free and fulfilling life is going to be constrained by their economic circumstances.
It's like saying everyone is free to run a marathon, but some people are starting miles behind the starting line.
Right, exactly. And critics argue that Mill's focus on individual liberty, while important, can sometimes blind us to these systemic factors that shape our choices and opportunities.
So it's not enough to just have formal legal rights. We also need to address the social and economic conditions that can prevent people from fully exercising those rights.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important point to keep in mind when reading Mill. His work provides a valuable framework for thinking about individual freedom, but it's not a complete picture. We need to also consider the broader context in which individuals live and make choices.
So while On Liberty remains an incredibly influential and thought-provoking work, it's not without its limitations. But even the criticisms of Mill's ideas can be valuable, right? They can help us to refine our own thinking about freedom, responsibility, and the role of society.
I think so. Engaging with these criticisms can help us to develop a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of Mill's work and to apply his ideas in a way that is both thoughtful and relevant to the challenges we face today.
Well said. And on that note, I want to encourage all of our listeners to dive into On Liberty for themselves. It's a challenging read at times, but it's incredibly rewarding. You can find a link to purchase the book in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more explorations of fascinating topics and thought-provoking ideas. We'll be back soon with another deep dive, so stay curious, keep exploring, and until next time, happy reading.